So thank you very much for being here. I'm Jerry, this is Laura, and we're going to hand this back and forth. I'm going to show you some slides, and if you have questions along the way, please raise your hand, or concerns, or comments, or complaints, or if we say something that feels difficult to you, please don't hesitate to raise your hand, and let's talk about that. Because Physicians for Social Responsibility started going to the Middle East in 1993. We were invited to come as members of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War by the Israeli chapter. When we told them that we wanted to go into the West Bank and spend a lot of time there and Gaza and in Gaza, and that we wanted to visit with Mordecai Vanunu, they withdrew their invitation to us. And that wasn't a bad withdrawal of the invitation, but someone sent a fax across the desk of one of the IPPNW people and put him in a very bad political position. So they felt as though they needed to withdraw that invitation, and WPSR decided that it wouldn't go. Well, I'd been waiting all my life, and it just happened that I had the time to raise my hand and say, I'll work on this. And I just, since I went in January of 1993, have not been able to stop going. And some years I go once, sometimes I go twice, sometimes I go 3 times. And I just love going there. And in the process of going there, my husband and I have a family, a Palestinian family that's Palestinian and American, and we have Palestinian godchildren now. And tomorrow I get to go to South Bend, Indiana, where they are finishing their education and attend a play that 2 of my Palestinian godsons are going to be in. So it's part of our lives. And Laura started going with us in 2005. And we've been to Jordan and to Syria together to visit Iraqi refugees. And we've been, again, 3 times in the last couple of years to Gaza to do medical service work. Well, PSR is traditionally not a medical service organization. That's not what we do. We're funded as an educational organization, but in 1993 we met an extraordinary man named Iyad El-Sarraj, who's a child psychiatrist, and started the Gaza Community Mental Health Program in Gaza. And Iyad has had a blood cancer and hasn't been able to travel as much. And one of the things that he and I talked about was that PSR really needed to do something that was more than just education, that we had skills and expertise that Gaza under siege needed to have. So we began organizing these medical service delegations. And Laura, who is a urologist, outstayed one of our delegations by a full week to practice, and she can tell you about that. But we've been really humbled by the experience of going in and being of the people and with the people. And the first time we went in, we were kind of looked at as though we were oddities, because, you know, you parachute into someone's life and they're not sure that you're going to stick around, or that it's not just kind of a lark, and that you're being sort of a medical tourist. And then we went back the second time, and they began to believe that maybe we were sincere in wanting to be with our colleagues in Gaza and provide some kind of care. And we have identified specific problems that we can help with. And then by the third time that we went back, in a year and a half or a little more than that, then they began to have an expectation that we might come back again. And I guess developmentally that's a good thing, you know. First they're not sure about you, and then they begin to be sure of you. And now, you know, now we're friends. And when I called my friend in Gaza this morning at 6 o'clock, and I said, "How are things?" He said, "Oh, they're just great. When are you coming back?" You know. So that's good. So we'll go through these slides, and Laura will talk. I tend to yak too much, and Laura has to grab the microphone from me.
I'm going to invite Jerry to comment on that last that last slide, which was depictive of the wall art you see both in the West Bank and in Gaza. A lot of the Gaza Strip is surrounded by walls, certainly the northern Israeli border. And that is one section of art. And Jerry's husband is a wonderful photographer, and you may see only a snippet of his work there, but that's a painting on a wall, and it's representative, we think, of how the people are often feeling, that is a gesture of peace. And you see the Red Crescent ambulance, and that's the equivalent of Red Cross in the back. I don't know whether I'm blocking the view. Will you speak up if you need us to move so that you can see the slides? We've been asked to stay here because our presentation is being videoed, but we want to make sure you can see it. Can you see? Great.
Throughout the West Bank, there is protest wall art. In Gaza, the wall art is more for the Palestinian people, and that woman is representative. So we called this talk Imagine Gaza. And I'm going to ask you to imagine living in Gaza, that you can't go out and get in your car and drive across the bridge to Washington State. You can't go out and get in your car and drive across to Burnside. That you are not able to get the medicine that you need for your heart. That when your wife or you are pregnant and in trouble, you can't get the medical care that you need. And there's no way for this to happen emergently in most situations. Living in Gaza is an incredible life. And one of the reasons that you begin to imagine living there like that is to understand the feeling of the collective punishment that is Gaza. And I want to make this very clear. I'm not talking to you about that there isn't terror on both sides of that wall, because there is terror on both sides of that wall. There is fear and sadness, and there are hundreds of thousands of people in the surrounding territory that is called Israel who want this to stop. And somehow or other, the human beings involved have been unable to make that happen. This is not a political talk. This is for you to be able to understand, and many of you already do, and I know that, and I apologize for kind of going on about this, but to understand that part of what we do is work with the mental health people in Gaza. And the mental health of Gaza has suffered in a disastrous way. So if you can think about the imprisonment, I think it helps to understand. I think it even helps to understand, somebody has a puppy. It even helps to understand how you could lose all of your hope and become desperate enough to do something that would be disastrous to yourself and to others on an individual basis. So this is, can you point that out, Laura, up there? Just show, this is the Middle East. What Laura's pointing at is the pink part is what we call Israel, and the sort of butterfly brown shape is the West Bank. Let me see if I can get the cursor to go up there. Cursor is not, the cursor doesn't want to follow my finger very well. We're coming in on it though, there. Okay, that's the West Bank. Now this little teeny tiny piece of land, which is almost impossible, is Gaza, right down here on the Mediterranean Sea. Everybody see it? There's a blow up, the West Bank, and then you see that little strip. Some people call it Gaza, some people call it the Gaza Strip, and there's the strip. Gaza is about, how many of you have been to Seattle and have been to Lake Washington? So Gaza is about the same length as Lake Washington. and it has about 25 miles long, 5 to 7 miles wide. There's 1.6 million people living there, about half the size of New York. 2/3 of the people who live there are refugees from 1948, from the time of Israeli independence, in 1967, when things changed, and we're not going to go into all that history, but significantly more people entered Gaza in 48 and 67. Many of them are refugees from all over what was at the time of the Palestinian area and Israel and before Israel. Hey, Bill Dienst. Over half. Bill Dienst has been with us. Over half are under 18 years of age. Majority are Muslim. And I have written on here again, because I don't think this can be emphasized enough, nearly every person in Gaza is traumatized. Nearly every person. And I say nearly only because I haven't talked to every person. But certainly every person I've talked to is traumatized. How about you?
Yes, every person I've talked to is traumatized. Well, for example, on my first medical trip there, I'm a surgeon, I'm a people plumber, and the surgeons were very matter of fact, and we were dealing with the patients and addressing that. And I'd ask questions, and they were pretty circumspect. But after they got to know me a little bit, after 1 or 2 days, it was not hard for them to start sharing what it had been like for them to be there in the cast-lead operation when they'd not ever dealt with so much war trauma, to have 100 people dying in their arms, or pulling the sheet over that kind of trauma, or the trauma of having your children be crying and screaming for nights on end because of the planes going over, or the drones, or the bullets in your house, that kind of trauma. Well, things like bedwetting, things like night terrors, things like depression, anxiety. Yeah. They can't turn to drink because alcohol isn't there readily available anymore, but otherwise that.
But indeed, there are other aspects of that, and we'll go into some more of that. But why go there? All over the world there are people who need help, and I described that a little bit. We have this good friend who lives there and works there, but also the idea of a people who have been circumscribed in such a strong way and can't get in, can't get out, can't transfer themselves, can't get ongoing medical education. We just began to believe that it was time for a delegation of people who had some awareness of them to go back in. So we've been now on our 3rd trip, and we'll go back, I hope, in November to see them again. Around Gaza, the borders have been at least pretty circumscribed. From the top, now can I get it there? Does that work?
Yep.
Okay, up here is Eretz checkpoint, which is the way people get in from Israel into Gaza. The Israelis have built a huge place that could serve up to about 30,000 people a day. Now, including all the humanitarian workers, like people from the United Nations, including the emergent medical cases that go in and out, they serve maybe 2,000 people a day, maybe. Over here is if I can find it, is the Kearney crossing, which is the biggest crossing that used to serve trucks going in, but has been closed because they think it's a security risk. Down here is Kerem Shalom, where most of the goods and materials go through now, and I'll show you some slides about that. And down at the bottom is Rafah, the border with Egypt. Now, some of you are aware of this, that the Egyptians announced within the last 2 weeks that they were planning to open the Rafah border freely, to let Palestinians go in and out and let goods and materials go in and out. The Egyptians are working under a 2005 agreement, which was drafted around the time that the Israelis withdrew settlements from Gaza, which meant that, in fact, the Gaza border with Egypt was going to be controlled, and not very many people would be able to go in and out. And in fact, sometimes it's controlled completely. We'll see what happens. You can watch the newspaper and see if they really do open that border. It would make a significant difference because all along the Rafah border, all along that southern border of Gaza, there are places where there are tunnels. How many of you have heard of these tunnels? The tunnels go 15 to 30 meters deep and across into Egypt. And sometimes they're bombed, and sometimes accidents happen with land and people are killed. And we have heard the latest estimate is something over 200 people have died in those tunnels. But a lot of people and goods and materials come through the tunnels, and they've become a real money earner for some people. But we'll talk more about that. So this is Eretz, the way to get in through Israel. And you can't film the Israeli side, but this is the cage that you walk through to get from Israel into Gaza. And this is the Rafah border. Here's a slide that shows you that even though there has been a lot of destruction of buildings, and I'll show you a little bit more about that later, the blue bars are the number of the volume of gravel, steel, and cement that are needed. And the yellow bars are what actually has been coming in. Now, bear in mind that these are supplies that come in for aid organizations like United Nations Relief Works Association, not for the general public. The general public doesn't have access to this stuff. And these are other goods and supplies like food, peanut butter, flour, that kind of thing. And you will see that this is from up until March, and then going on into this year, it looks as though more supplies are coming in. However, yesterday, this constant threat thing happened. You won't be able to read this little tiny writing, but tanks went through the border and destroyed some, what they thought were growing tunnels. And anytime that happens, anytime there's an incursion from Israel, all importation of goods and materials stops. Well, if that's true, and the United Nations is feeding about half the population of Gaza, and they can't get anything, then sometimes their warehouses get almost empty. And so the people of Gaza are in a bad time. This is an airport that Bill Clinton helped to open and then was subsequently bombed and disabled, and nobody uses it now. And then because the people of Gaza are fishermen, it's important for us to know that they are no longer allowed out into deep water to do deep water fishing. So that one primary source of food and an income has been cut off from them.
I would just add to that, the sea border, marine border was 12 miles out is legal, and then it got cut back to 6 miles, and now it's 3. And fishermen will still go out in that very shallow water. The water is not clean. Raw sewage is dumped with regularity into it because there's no way of treating it. So the fish that are being caught are very small, so they're overfishing because they don't have an option otherwise. But it's quite impressive to stand on the side of the beach and look out and see the gunboats. And they're particularly apparent at night when you can see the lights of the big boats compared to these boats here. They don't have the fishing trawlers that we have in Washington and Oregon.
In Gaza, the United Nations reports that 90 to 95% of the water is polluted, and that within the next 5 years there will be not one drop of clean water in all of Gaza. The aquifer that it provides most of the water is being overpumped, with a population of 1.6 million heading to double within the next 10 to 20 years to 3.2 million. The need for water in this desert area is enormous. But here's this aquifer that's being overpumped. Along the Israeli border, the Israelis have sunk wells that would have provided some refurbishing of the aquifers from the Israeli side, but those wells are taking away all the water that could have helped to restore the aquifers. So on both sides, from population and from overpumping of the aquifer and from the wells that are taking away the fresh water, the people of Gaza are suffering from no clean water. There's a move to put in desalinization plants, but those cost money that they don't have, and they require materials that aren't available. The Israelis have promised that there will be some desalinization plants. The sewage that comes from Gaza is partially or fully untreated and flows freely into the Mediterranean. So when Laura tells you that you look out and you see these boats, if you look out where there is sewage flowing into the Mediterranean, you can also see huge brown pools in the blue Mediterranean, and that's just plain sewage, and it smells. And you know, we can tell you all about all these environmental concerns, but you know that every environmental concern carries with it a health concern. That you don't have unclean water without disease, and you don't have unclean air without disease, and you don't have bad soil, which is true, that there's more chlorides in the soil and more nitrates in the soil from both the sewage and from fertilizers than the soil can stand. So you don't have any of that pollution stuff without it affecting the health of everyone in Gaza. We'll show you the whoops. You don't want to miss this one. This is Wadi Gaza, just outside Gaza City. There's a dead donkey lying in the sewage, which this used to be a small river. Now this is primarily just free-flowing, partially or untreated sewage. Even if they try to treat their sewage, because their electricity only runs every 8 hours, go 8 hours on, 8 hours off, and not everybody can afford generators or they run out of fuel, then even the partially treated sewage is often fully untreated. They've built a temporary sewage treatment plant in the south of Gaza, but that's built in sand. You want to address that?
On our last trip, we were joined by a toxicologist, so we actually went to some really fascinating sites that were beyond the scope of our usual health practice, much more public health. And we went to this septic system site, and it was clear that it was built in sandy soil, and the reason for that was not the choice of the people of Gaza, but although Israel has left the country and arguably doesn't control it, they don't want anything like a septic system built closer to the eastern border where the soils would be more appropriate for a drainage field for managing septic waste, because that would be a risk, a security risk. That's their statement. So the septic system is built in sandy soil where really it's minimally effective in improving the water quality that is dumped into the Mediterranean.
And then when the electricity goes off, of course, the sewage just flows through that sandy soil and goes right out into the Mediterranean. So it's a very minimally effective system. Because the electricity is cut so often, the businesses in Gaza have all attempted to get these small generators. Those little generators pollute the air. Most of them are using gasoline that they get from Egypt. The gasoline that comes from Egypt is not lead-free. So these generators, which pollute the air with noise and with fumes and with lead, completely pollute the air in Gaza City. And I don't have a statistic, but we were told that the rate of childhood asthma is skyrocketing, and that they blame that, of course, on the pollution caused by these generators. The generators come through the tunnel, the leaded gas comes through the tunnels, and the pollution is terrible. Plus, the gasoline is very expensive for them.
I think she covered everything, don't you?
Want to talk about food?
So, food is an interesting subject there because someone as a bystander might think, wow, I see tomatoes and oranges and bananas in the market, and that this food would be readily available for everyone. Well, through the tunnels, food is available, but it's very costly, and so many, many people do not have access to those lovely oranges or heads of cabbage. That would be one reason it wouldn't be accessible. Another reason that you might not want to eat it is that those portions of produce raised in the Gaza Strip are potentially a toxic minefield from the depleted uranium, from white phosphorus, from other substances we don't know of, from, as Jerry was alluding to earlier, because there's not water, it's a desert, and over many years they've used a lot of pesticides and fertilizers, not just the Gazans, but when the Israelis were there, they had that desert bloom. Another food source, I see Jerry's slide and I missed that because they're not fishing in the way they used to be able to. That was a source of animal protein. Otherwise, their diet could be balanced in protein because they do have a lot of a mixture of two different kinds of either fava beans or garbanzo beans that are made in bean dishes mixed with cracked wheat and vegetables. I think the diet would otherwise be really healthy if you had access to the food, but so many children and young adults are not nourished well. Jerry has a wonderful picture in a bit, I think. That
There's what they call the no-go zone that runs all along the border with Israel, and it's hard to see here, but along here there's the wall, the separation wall, the security fence it's also called. So this out here is Israel, and in here is about a third of the arable land in Gaza, and they're not allowed to use it for security reasons. So sometimes when they can risk it, they'll run out and try to tend to a crop, but it's not unusual for someone to be killed if they go out in that area. So most people have decided that it's not worth the risk. We know that a year ago, it was reported that the rate of chronic malnutrition in children had risen to over 10%. Now, that's about half what we saw in Iraq after 13 years of sanctions, but this is 4 years of siege, and so it's not getting better. A child who has chronic malnutrition has hair that should be the color of mine when I was that age, and looks like this kind of ruddy red hair. Their skin, which should be dark and healthy looking, is pale like this. Their lips are usually pale like this. And if you have a 12-year-old, you would probably think the child was 8 years old, not 12 years old, because they have minimal growth and they have inability to learn or diminished ability to learn. They have fewer resistances to disease, and it becomes a huge public health problem. So chronic malnutrition is just not sort of a static state for today or tomorrow, but is a problem for the next generation. In 2008 in December and 2009 in January, many of you know that in response to rockets being fired out of Gaza and toward Ashdod and Sderot, the Israelis attacked Gaza. It's difficult to compare the numbers of people that were killed because it just sounds bad. You know, half of the people from Israel that were killed by friendly fire, but there were, maybe 25 people killed. Is that about right? And 1,400 people from Gaza were killed, but the ongoing destruction is hard for the people of Gaza to live with. The buildings are destroyed. A brand new lab at one of the universities with all its reagents and all its ability to do testing was almost flattened. So when we talk about the ongoing trauma, this is part of it. This level of destruction with the inability to repair or reconstruct because of the lack of ability to import materials. One of the classes that I teach when I'm in Gaza is to teach mental health providers or first responder caregivers who are being educated by the Gaza Community Mental Health Program on working with the people across the length and width of Gaza about remembering that what they are experiencing is a normal response to an abnormal situation. A normal response to an abnormal situation. That they fear constantly being harmed today, tomorrow. And in one of my last classes, a woman raised her hand and said, my 7-year-old child comes home from school almost every day and says to me, what if they bomb us today? And there was a class, maybe about as many as are in this room, and they were all professionals. And I said, how do you respond to that? And a guy in the back of the room said, well, I'd just tell him it's not going to happen. And everyone else in the room went, you can't say that. And I said, do you know for sure it's not going to happen? And he said, well, no, but I just would want him to think that I would stop it. Well, we came up with some other strategies, talk about what you will do if this happens again and say that you hope it won't. But that level of concern is everywhere. Some more wall art.
We've talked a little bit about this. The situation with the power is complex in that although some comes from Israel and some comes from Egypt, part of the problem with not getting consistent electricity throughout the day is a reflection of the ongoing conversations between Fatah and Hamas. And the government of Gaza is run by the elected party Hamas, and the Fatah people who are running, not people, but government out of Ramallah, argue that the bill is not being paid by the Hamas government, and so therefore they're not providing all the electricity they might. But however it's left, what you see is in every hospital, and there are quite a few, the hospitals are considerably smaller than what we think of as a hospital here, so they might be 10-bed hospitals. But each of them has a generator because the power most definitely goes out every day consistently. We'd be in the operating room and there'd be a little flutter. But you imagine, instead you're living in your home. All you care about is that your child gets an education, but the power goes off. It's 7 o'clock. It's not summer, so it's dark by then. So you buy a generator because you want your child to be able to study. Anything else that's on the slide is certainly valuable to read, but there's so much more we have. Like these wonderful pictures.
So these are pictures of the tunnels. And these are published pictures of the tunnels, and this says 15 to 20 meters down, but actually we were told 15 to 30 meters down, and there are estimated to be about 500 tunnels that run along that border, but that only about 50 of them are working right now. The tunnels didn't start in 2005. The tunnels have been in existence for a very long time, but increased a lot after the start of the siege. And then what the hope is that the tunnels will not be used if the Rafah border opens. That's the hope. But there's a lot of money being made in these tunnels, that people who dig the tunnels, people who run the stuff, and the Hamas government is collecting a tax on the tunnels. So, and again, this is not a political talk, but there is a lot of dissension about the role of the Hamas government in Gaza, and that has yet to be seen what's going to happen with that. You probably know that the Fatah, the Palestinian Authority government, and Hamas have agreed to try to agree. And so the election that was scheduled for this July has been put off, and we'll see what happens. The Prime Minister of Hamas has offered to step down and see if they can come up with some kind of a coalition government. Maybe that'll happen. We'll see.
I just want to make sure that I don't miss something that Jerry has crafted on these the slides. Many of the hospitals were partially bombed, and certainly the main teaching hospital that we several of us worked out of. This is my vivid memory. The first trip I took there was from a young surgeon who acknowledged that he was preparing to make an incision in someone's abdomen, and then heard this loud crash, left the patient, loud boom, crashes, ran out and realized that the mosque across the street had been bombed, realized that the power generator had flipped on in the hospital, and he went back in and did what he had to do, and he cried later. And over the course of the next several days, most of the men that I got to know on that first trip and in subsequent trips were in the hospitals wherever they landed for the next 20 to 30 days. They didn't get home to see their families. Cell phone connection were difficult, challenging, and Gaza is a small place, but it was extremely difficult to get around, and people were concerned for their safety because it wasn't a bombing that happened once and destroyed everything. It was ongoing for the 21, 22 days. So one of the things we have seen every time we're on a trip is that with the blockade, which existed prior to the cast-lead operation, so that's bad enough, the bombing, but even without that, medical supplies do not consistently get in. So even though we were just recently there in January and took thousands of dollars worth of psychiatric medications because we are sponsored by a group of mental health professionals, and those are medications that are sought after, they're requesting already a new batch because with 1.5 million citizens, you can imagine we can't carry in enough. And medications are not being, although you would think they would be part of the shipments authorized to come across the border, they're inconsistently arriving there. So things also like pieces of equipment that normally here, if I have a piece of equipment that I paid thousands of dollars for and it's not working, I call the technician in Tuscaloosa. Well, that wasn't a good, but I would call, not now. Let's say I'd called down from Seattle to Bend, Oregon, and some guy would come help me fix that piece of equipment. That doesn't happen there. The physicians and the nurses and nurse practitioners we all work with don't have the ability to go off to a medical meeting and continue their education.
So this is urologic surgery in Gaza. This is Laura's darling husband, right here in front. Point him out, will you? And I would just say that in Jabalia Camp, which is known to be the most densely populated place on earth, Rich Grady found a cohort of children with ambiguous genitalia, one of about only 5 such cohorts in the world. Probably, and Laura will talk to you about this a little bit, but Rich is an expert at this, about operating on these kids. So they want him to come back. They want him to participate in helping that population.
So ambiguous genitalia it occurs in this country too. So a child is born and the first question we're often asking, is it a boy or is it a girl? And once in a while it's very clear that, wow, we're not sure. But there are other times when a baby is born and you think it's a little girl. But just this last trip, I worked closely with my husband, and although I don't do the surgery of the pediatric, they would bring a baby out and say, oh, look. And I'd pull the diaper down and think it's a girl until I'd realize there was a testicle within the labia, those kind of things. And then it's a challenging situation to deal with anywhere in the world because what you do surgically, but to realize that within families we were seeing 3 and 4 children all with the same condition. And is it because a lot of first cousins are marrying each other, which does happen, and because there's not free movement much at all in Gaza now, but even prior to that, there was a lot of consanguinity? Or is it something more ominous with what they're exposed to? I tend to believe that if we could get some materials over there and to do some genetic testing, that it's probably more related to the patterns of social connection than it is to, oh, the depleted uranium did this, but we don't know. We don't know what kind of toxic pool there is there. What I will say is that it's a fascinating study, and also I just like anyone in the audience who is a physician, you don't want to be a patient who someone says, you're fascinating.
So this cute guy in the middle is my husband. My husband is a cardiologist, an adult cardiologist. That is, he serves adults. He wouldn't classify himself as an adult, but he's about as sweet a human being as ever walked the earth. And those two cardiologists on either side of him thought the same thing, and they go along swimmingly. What he discovered by serving cardiac patients, and I said this to somebody earlier, what happens when we're going into Gaza is that the Gaza Community Mental Health Program puts into the local paper the pediatric urologist is coming back to Gaza, and people flood the clinic. And they say, you know that cute cardiologist, he's coming back to Gaza, and people fled the clinic. So what he discovered is that even though there are facilities for helping people, most people who have surgically treatable cardiac illnesses have trouble getting out to have their surgical needs taken care of, either in Jerusalem or Ramallah or Nablus. But he served a very elderly man who badly needed his heart to be operated on, and he was seen 3 or 4 times during the 9 days that we were there that first time, and they had it all set up for him to go out, and then a security check on his background proved that one of his grandsons had been arrested for throwing rocks, and so he was immediately denied exit. It turned out that 8 months later, a cardiac surgery team came in, and he had his surgery in Gaza by a visiting team. So it means a lot to these folks when people come in and help them do things that they aren't able to provide. When I teach, we talk about the constant threat that exists. There's a fellow named Jonathan Shea. Any of you who have done a lot of reading on PTSD, and Marion, you probably have done a lot of this reading. Jonathan Shea wrote Achilles in Vietnam and Odysseus in America. And if you want to read about PTSD, those are 2 really fine books to read. John talks about that we should not call it PTSD, we should call it PTSI. If you broke your arm, you wouldn't call it a disorder, you would call it an injury. You would say that you had been injured, not that you had some kind of inborn disorder. So in Gaza, I began talking about that we could call what they are experiencing constant injury. And we renamed this phenomenon CTSI, continuous traumatic shock injury. And that seems to be able to help them identify the ongoing nature of what they're experiencing, to put a name on it and to think about what the symptoms are and how they can help each other through it. Oh, I'll tell you about the sand toys. Well, a nurse practitioner in Seattle who had planned to go with us this last time, and she's a psychiatric nurse practitioner who has a deep-seated specialty in caring for children with psychiatric disorders, put together thousands and thousands of sand play toys. And then she sorted them all out into categories and sent them with us. So, and she sent anatomically correct boys and girls and puppets and all kinds of things she sent. And it happened that just before we went into Gaza, a psychiatrist had just finished his child psychiatry residency at Hadassah Hospital in Israel and had returned. And the day that we gave him all of those toys, his eyes just lit up. And he said, even at Hadassah Hospital, I didn't have such tools to work with. So he's eager for this young woman to come back with us and put together a program on how to use all those sand toys to allow children to process what it is that they're going through. Someone asked me today, is there just a sense of hopelessness? And indeed, there is a sense of hopelessness in some people, and I submit to you that no one blows himself up if he feels very hopeful, and all that Tommy wrote about virgins and paradise is exactly that. It doesn't come from the Quran. But there is this horrible sense of nothing happening that is pervasive among some of the men especially. You can imagine that in a male-dominated society or in a male-headed society that men who are not able to work, can't go out of Gaza to work, can't produce anything that can be sold outside Gaza, their crops fail. We saw that the unemployment rate was somewhere between 45 and 85%, depending on what part of Gaza you were in. So that creates problems in a family, and there's a sense of overwhelming sorrow that accompanies that sense of uselessness. I have a friend now, a nurse in Gaza, who delivered a baby in February after we were there, and I called her and talked to her and said, how are things going? And she said, well, the baby has at least given my husband something to do. So there's a little hope in our family now. But a lot of frustration and anger, and still this sense of resilience, which is just incredible to watch and to listen to. Some years ago, the Gaza Community Mental Health Program put together women empowerment clinics. And those clinics are taking in more and more women, and more of the clinics are being formed. And women empowerment is a big movement across the Middle East, but it's huge in Gaza. What they're trying to do with women empowerment, teach them about politics, teach them about good health, teach them about breastfeeding. They have exercise clinics in these areas, and it's inspiring to see. And it's not huge, but it's growing. And there's then that persistent sense of resilience. Education among the Palestinian people is a huge issue. And for the United Nations to tell us that they are double and triple shifting the kids in all their classes when they are educating at least half the kids in Gaza, and that they have schools approved for construction. They need, how many, 800? They need 800 new schools, and they've had 8 approved for building. It's just sad to see that kids are suffering in such a way. Now talk about Sahar.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Approved by who?
Approved by Israel.
As you might have discerned, Jerry and I are in love with the people of Gaza, and we're particularly in love with the women of Gaza. And it's this picture represents 2 of the women we most love, and the young woman in the upper left corner is Sahar. And Jerry first met her on the first medical mission trip, and she served as your interpreter, I believe. And you'll notice that her head is not covered. And the majority of women now in Gaza are covering their head, whereas that was not true before Hamas took over. And in the lower right-hand corner, in the turquoise, is a physician who's a dermatologist, very active also in women's empowerment issues. And they're both challenged as being different in their society, but they will not back down. And particularly the younger woman, Sahar, Jerry and I would both concur that she will be the Prime Minister of a united West Bank and Gaza. And she's so articulate and well-spoken and thoughtful. But these are only tiny representations of the many young women we met. If you look at the medical school and the engineering schools, it's not true that Arab culture doesn't want to educate their women. And it's not just because of the UNRWA or the United Nations schools that were primary. Fathers are very proud of their daughters, and the girls are getting well educated. And I would say about Sahar how brave she is. We had one day off. They work 6 days a week, so we had a Friday off. And we went down to Rafah, and she went with us. And it was a little unnerving for her, because I think like going to another part of this country where there might be more radical Christian element, there's a more radical Islamic element down there, and she is a very attractive young woman who wasn't covering her head, and she expressed relief when she got back into Gaza City, which is just a few miles away. So it is not as easy in some ways for a young woman in Gaza now as it was a few years ago.
I was walking next to her, and a young man said to her, "Tell him you're a Christian." Because she really was feeling as though she was about to be persecuted. So that's it. These are people who want a future, who can't really, in some instances, imagine that they're going to have a future. And they need the support of people who are aware of them. They need you and me to make a difference.